Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. So it's June the 23rd, 9 years to the day when people in the UK went to vote in the referendum on leaving the EU. Those campaigning for it claimed it would solve so many problems. At the very worst, it would still make things better. Yet the most famous Brexit campaigner, Nigel Farage, now claims that Brexit has been a disaster and that the country has never been worse off. And yet he would still like you to believe that when he says he knows how to fix the country, he knows what he's doing. What he's not doing is telling you exactly how Brexit screwed you all over, so I'm going to go over 10 of the biggest ways Brexit made your lives worse. So why did we suddenly get lots of raw sewage being dumped into our waterways by water companies a few years ago? Yes, the profit-hungry nature of the privatised industry was the driving force, but why did it seem to become a particularly bad problem overnight a few years ago? Because treating raw sewage requires chemicals. In 2019, it was reported that we import 73% of them from the EU. So if you make those chemicals more difficult and expensive to obtain, you will of course motivate water companies to dump raw sewage whenever they can to save money. So how did Brexit affect the import of these chemicals? Well, first of all, expensive paperwork was now required to import anything from the EU. But chemicals have even more, because they're dangerous, as well as special arrangements for transport. The pound became weaker in the wake of Brexit, making imports in general more expensive. Because lorries were being held up for hours at a time to get clearance, which didn't happen before Brexit, we were literally taking lots of lorries off the roads to sit idle. With an already stretched logistics sector, this meant delays in getting orders fulfilled. Also, because Boris Johnson thought we should do everything on our own, we ended up duplicating quality checks, making the chemicals even more expensive. So a combination of having to pay more for the chemicals, as well as struggling to get deliveries in time, meant that the profit-driven water industry decided that the easiest way was to pressure the government into turning a blind eye if they wanted to avoid bad Brexit publicity and let them dump anyway. And now look where we are. You have to pre-book a hospital appointment every time you want to dip your toes in a river. Brexit has also hit our ability to grow our own food, making us more reliant on imports, something that makes us vulnerable should geopolitical alliances go bad in the future. In terms of British farmed food, we have some of the same problems which led to higher costs for sewage treatment chemicals. Farmers also need materials imported, but there are additional problems for farming as well. Dropped freedom of movement made it more difficult for farms to employ seasonal labour, particularly at harvest time. Although special visas were allowed for farm workers, not enough were issued, and it was too much of a hassle for EU workers who just worked on other European farms instead. This literally left crops rotting in the fields and farmers having to plant less for following years to cut down on waste. This had an immediate impact on the amount of crops being grown in Britain. And because we couldn't grow as much ourselves, we had to import more. And imports were more expensive, remember, due to a combination of hard bordered controls and the weaker pound. So this added a level of food price inflation on top of that caused by the likes of the war in Ukraine. The government also phased out the farming subsidies which farmers got while we were in the EU. This increased the cost for farmers with no easy way to simply raise their prices if they were dependent on supermarket contracts because they were locked in.
Finding people now is becoming increasingly difficult. At the beginning of May, we were 40% short of the people we should have here. They were all recruited, they just hadn't got the visas processed. We lost 750,000 bunches of spring onions with a value of about 100,000. So overall, shortage of labour cost us £250,000 in May.
More recently, thanks to the post-Brexit trade deals Boris Johnson used to sell the UK out, supermarkets are now stocking cheaper meat, which is farmed to lower standards of animal welfare. For example, Morrison's has drawn recent criticism for claiming it supports British farmers while selling meat from Australia and South America. It also means that when there are shortages in the supply chain, such as a bad harvest in the EU, or conflicts threatening shipping, then the shortages will be very visible in the supermarkets. For example, 2 years ago, when tomatoes were conspicuous by their absence. One of the most destructive aspects of Brexit was the way in which the vitriolic arguments divided people. Friendships and family relations fell apart and everyone became defined by whether they were for or against leaving. Some people who want to move on ask why we have to keep talking about something that happened 9 years ago. It's because it still defines us. Even today, polls still separate voters by how they claim to have voted in the 2016 referendum. It's actually quite depressing. It's normal to see polls divide people according to demographics which are likely to influence the way they vote, such as gender, age, what sort of work they do. We know that all of these things are influential on people's political beliefs. But to see the Leave-Remain split being used as well is a sign of just how deeply ingrained the issue has become in our society. The reason pollsters are still using this split is not because they are behind the times, but because people's views of political issues are still coloured by whether they tended to support Remain or Leave. The reason we're still talking about it is because it has now become a core part of who we are, whether we like it or not. Now, as well as looking at the details in polls to see what women think about something, or the over 65s or Lib Dem voters, we're now looking for what Leave voters think of a particular issue, or Remain voters. It's become a demographic for the long term. It's not healthy for society that you can predict how someone thinks about a given issue based on whether they voted Remain or Leave. If a vote that happened 9 years ago is still deciding major government policy today, it is going to be talked about. But the divisions weren't isolated to policy. Just days before the referendum, an MP was murdered by a far-right extremist. Labour MP Joe Cox was murdered, and the lies and toxicity in the Brexit debate were partly blamed for this. A few years later, during 2019, the most divisive of the Brexit years, people and MPs were calling for the likes of Boris Johnson and Mark Francois to dial down their rhetoric because of the tensions it was inflaming. Joe Cox's successor urged Boris Johnson, Prime Minister at this point, to be more careful about his language and remember Cox. Johnson outraged a lot of people by saying the best way to honour Joe Cox's memory was to get Brexit done. Mark Francois also suggested that he thought the public would turn violent if we didn't leave the EU by the end of October 2019. This was effectively saying that he would not blame people for directing violence towards MPs because it would be the fault of those MPs. And this violent behaviour and rhetoric all fed down through communities to individual, family and friendship groups. One of the reasons why Labour, now led by some of the most famous Remainers in the country, has to be cautious is because people do not want those wounds reopening. The psychological damage caused by Brexit is immense, and that damage was caused deliberately. And that damage continues. And for people asking why we must keep talking about it 9 years later, I say because it is now part of the fabric of our society. When pollsters and politicians no longer analyse public opinion according to Brexit votes, that's when we will have finally shaken the monkey off our back. But while we are still defined according to our Brexit vote, for those of us who were allowed one, it's an integral part of our society and politics. The cost of both domestic and business energy rates in Britain has increased substantially over the last few years. A huge part of this, of course, was the reordering of global gas supplies after Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Despite the fact that the UK bought almost no fuel from Russia, because we pay the full international market rates for fuel, even from the North Sea, any global impact hits us. However, the hard Brexit also put pressures on energy supplies in Britain. Leaving the EU internal energy market, which was not necessary even to leave the single market, means that we lost the ability to trade electricity and gas easily. That led to more blackouts during high demand periods because we cannot seamlessly match supply and demand across Europe as we used to. Then there's gas prices. Because we generate such a lot of our electricity from gas currently, and it's the most expensive way of producing our electricity, the price we pay is based on the price of producing electricity from gas. But gas is now much more expensive, even beyond the impacts of political instability from gas-producing nations. We used to be part of the EU's collective purchasing power, which gave us better prices. Now that we're buying just for ourselves, we have to pay a higher price. That's just how it works. Many don't realise this because they think we're getting gas from the North Sea, and the North Sea is part of Britain's territorial waters. But this isn't true. Even when the gas comes from the North Sea, we pay the full market price for it. It is sold on the international market. But we're now a smaller customer, so we pay a higher price. Brexit also hampered our ability to build up more wind power in particular, which not only generates electricity at a much lower cost compared to fossil fuels, but that cost is not affected by problems with Russia or the Middle East. So as well as ideological obstacles raised by Brexiteers who are also opposed to clean energy, Just the process of getting components for projects which were given permission became more difficult and expensive due to trade barriers with the European markets supplying them. We also lost out on EU subsidies for cheaper and cleaner energy products. However, this is an indirect impact of Brexit because the government could have chosen to replace those subsidies. Labour are now doing what the Conservatives refused. So although energy prices have been affected by Russia and the Middle East supplies being disrupted, they have also increased due to inefficiencies created by raising trade barriers with Europe. Brexit also made it harder to travel abroad for either business or holidays. Having a valid passport is no longer enough. Many people have been turned away at the border, losing money spent on booking holidays because their passport, though technically valid, did not have enough time left on it. People are expected to have at least 3 months left on their passport before being admitted entry so that it does not expire while you're inside. Though you should check with individual countries because this has little to do with the EU. Individual countries could determine their own rules for visitors without EU passports. Also, because people with a British passport are now third country citizens, we are only permitted to stay in the Schengen area, which covers most of the EU, for 90 days out of every 180. So passports have needed stamping with dates to make sure these periods are not exceeded. We also need to pass through manual passport checking, although we are going to be allowed to use automated e-gates soon. In fact, in some airports we already are, when they're ready for us. There have been delays. Despite mobile phone companies promising not to raise prices after Brexit as well, if you wanted to use a network outside your own country, most of them were lying. Free mobile roaming has pretty much ended, and using your phone in the EU can now be much more expensive. There is also another more expensive process for being able to travel with your pet. As for travelling for work, there's a whole heap of paperwork needed to do that, and because the documentation needed is down to individual countries, not the EU, you might need to go through a different process for different EU countries, and because the vast majority of people travelling in the EU for work have freedom of movement, the process is not very well resourced with staff. Almost nobody needs to make a short trip to Europe at short notice for work, but Brexit meant that suddenly lots of people from Britain were going to want to do that, but there is no quick process for arranging it. So if you are a consultant or a lecturer in Britain and a company in the Netherlands wants to book you to give a lecture the following week, you can probably forget it. You are unlikely to get the authorization to do so in time. Performers have also faced incredible barriers with carnet rules. You can't just wander in with a van full of musical equipment. You're basically exporting now, and you need all the paperwork to make sure you don't get charged tariffs for it. And getting the documentation in order means recording every single piece of equipment. You might have hundreds, and they all need documenting. This has prevented smaller, growing performers from working in the EU because the process is too onerous. And even the larger performers are upset. Elton John is not a happy bunny. Boris Johnson made a big deal of the fact that food production standards in the UK would not be lowered, and by and large this promise was mostly kept. However, what he didn't mention is that that was only going to apply to UK production. Those are the only standards which wouldn't be lowered, not foreign imports, and we import a lot of our food. So now we're importing meat from around the world where animal welfare standards are lower, for example. Morrison's made a big deal out of backing British farmers, as I say. Still selling meat from countries far and wide using more intensive farming methods that are allowed in the UK. But we also made ourselves vulnerable to dangerously unsafe food as well. One major danger of Brexit, where the end should now be in sight thanks to Labour's deal with the EU on border checks, is that because we didn't have any checks at all for years after Brexit and only started doing a few last year, dangerously unsafe food was coming into Britain from foreign criminals. One day, officials decided to carry out an experiment. They checked 22 lorries, something they couldn't do every day because they don't have the staff, don't have the facilities. But for one day, they checked. In 21 of the 22 lorries, they found maggot-ridden food, raw meat in plastic bags with no labels, raw meat dripping onto cream cakes, health hazards registering 11 on the scale, basically, and all intended to be bought and eaten by people on low income struggling with the cost of living and desperate enough to buy food from dodgy sources. Brexit had screwed these people over several times. Lowering the value of the pound, raising trade barriers made food from legitimate sources more expensive, and then this cheap but potentially deadly food was being waved through the border every day because the Tories spent no time developing the systems needed to check it. It was all very well talking about their advanced technology. All that does is record the paperwork electronically. What happens if someone falsifies the paperwork? It doesn't check that the paperwork matches what's in the back of the lorry. Only a person can do that. And there was nobody available to do it without slowing all the freight down to a crawl and creating massive shortages. So now we have food produced to lower standards from abroad. We have been importing dangerously unfit for consumption food as well. Another way in which Brexit screwed you all is shortages. A few I've covered in other points, such as chemicals for treating sewage, some foods, but the principles which cause shortages apply to everything, and there's plenty we're dependent upon the EU for. One reason why fresh food simply doesn't last as long from most supermarkets these days is because supply chains are now much less efficient. The foods are spending longer being transported, which means it can't spend as long on the shelves before it's gone off. But one huge problem with shortages is NHS medicines. People were warned before we left the EU, 80% of the drugs used in the NHS are imported from the rest of the EU single market. As soon as we threw up trade barriers, we made it more difficult to obtain them. It now takes more paperwork along with everything else, meaning more costs and longer delays. The delays at the border due to paperwork checking creates even greater delays. And the thing is, we don't have huge stockpiles of these drugs. Pharmacists in the NHS need to order when running low and get them in quickly. We don't have the facilities to store huge amounts of them. And some pharmaceuticals have a very short expiry date anyway. There was a plan to create a huge stockpile in Belgium and transport them to Britain on special ferries, but Boris Johnson gave the job to an imbecile who promptly messed it up and didn't bother to give the job to someone more competent. So now we have regular shortages of some very important life-saving medicines. There were always shortages at one time or other, maybe 20 or so medicines, but now we routinely get shortages of well over 100 types. And where medicine companies used to issue shortage warnings a few hundred times a year, now it's close to 2,000. And all because of an extreme Brexit, which was not on the referendum ballot. The referendum question was about leaving EU membership, not our place in the single market and customs union, neither of which needs EU membership. One of the major impacts of Brexit, which took place immediately after the referendum, rather than when we left the single market and customs union, was investment. Investment decisions need to be based on market conditions for the next few years, and this was thrown into turmoil. British companies held off investment decisions, with many deciding to use the money to set up in the EU, and foreign inward investment took an immediate hit after the referendum. You can see on this chart, with the blue line being actual investment and the pink line the general trend in the years before the referendum. It just stopped growing as companies, both foreign and domestic, were worried about the impact of Brexit on any investment decisions. And all this meant jobs not being grown, wages not being grown, tax revenues being stifled for the government. It just stopped our economic growth stone dead. And the impact on tax revenues is particularly topical right now. It is believed that the Treasury would have an additional £40 billion a year if we had not left the EU. Even with everything else being the same, this is roughly the same amount of money the government are committing to affordable housing over the next 10 years. That's the amount the Treasury is losing every single year because of Brexit. Imagine what we could do with an additional £40 billion. Not of the unpopular cuts, with plenty left over to boost defence spending, as well as even more for the NHS, transport and energy projects. And we'd have more and better jobs as well, because our economy would have continued to grow since 2016. The absolute tragedy of Brexit is that since COVID, the world has realised that global supply chains are vulnerable to shocks. So there's now been more emphasis on nearshoring, trying to focus on regional supply chains. Now, Trump is pursuing this rather more recklessly than most of the world, but most of the world is also still trying to bring production back home. The UK was in a great position to power up under these circumstances. But it all happened at exactly the same time we chose to raise trade barriers with our largest market. Absolutely insane. While we were in the EU, the most deprived parts of England and Wales received EU development funding. The Conservative government promised to simply provide those funds themselves, which made sense to people. After all, the EU were only allocating those funds from our membership fee, weren't they? Boris Johnson would just take that money back and give it to those same places directly. Only this has not occurred. There was no extra money for the NHS, only for private medical services, which they called NHS funding. And there was no Brexit version of the EU development funding for deprived areas. Particularly cruel when, because Brexit was driven largely by a protest against poverty, it was the most deprived areas which mostly voted to leave. So they lost funding from the European Regional Development Fund and the European Social Fund. After Brexit, they got almost nothing from the Conservative government. And what they did get was delayed, meaning many vital projects in those areas had to close down due to lack of funds. Exactly what the Tories wanted. Oh, you've shut down. Oh, you don't need the money anymore. That's fine. The EU money was used to fund training schemes, transport projects, other services which helped local businesses boost their competitiveness. Boris Johnson promised levelling up after Brexit. The reality was that the EU used to be a major force in levelling up by directing special funds to areas which most needed it, and after Brexit the gap between the richest and poorest parts of the country actually widened. And it got even worse than just not matching EU funding. Rishi Sunak, as Chancellor, was covertly filmed boasting about taking money from deprived areas and sending it to rich Tory areas.
From all of you, I managed to start changing the funding formulas to make sure that areas like this are getting the funding that they deserve. Because we inherited a bunch of formulas from the Labour Party that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas, and that needed to be undone. I started the work of undoing that.
So not only were they depriving these places of EU funding, they were even taking away the pre-existing British funding as well, a double blow. One of the cruelest ways in which Brexit screwed you all is with the damage it did to the NHS. Now, I've already talked about drug shortages, but the NHS is also the largest employer in Europe. We simply don't have the domestic medics to fully staff it, so we've always relied upon nurses, doctors, paramedics and so on from other countries. Leaving the EU caused a dramatic reduction in the number of EU workers available for the NHS. We tried to compensate with medical staff from Asia and Africa, but this did not compensate and has led to other problems such as higher overall immigration numbers due to workers from further afield being more likely to need to bring their family, which has turned into a political hot potato. And of course, because Brexit strangled our economy, the government had less money to spend on the NHS. Now, although the Conservatives would post higher and higher budgets for the NHS, ask yourselves why the results and queues just got longer and longer. It wasn't immigration, because most immigrants don't need the NHS. It was because the money was being used on increasingly expensive services, because Brexit meant we had to pay for more medicines, for more medical equipment, and so on. The extra cost of importing, the weaker pound, that hits food, chemicals and everything else. It also hits the NHS because they need to import a lot of specialist equipment and resources. So the cost of just doing the same job shot up, and all because of Brexit trade barriers with the EU. And the reason I call this cruel is because some people were conned into supporting Brexit in the belief the NHS would benefit. I remember an interview with a woman a few years ago who had a child with long-term health problems, and she said she voted Brexit for him. The likes of Boris Johnson, who sold that lie, knowing it was a lie, knowing they were actually going to get caring mothers to screw their child's future over. I don't think there are adequate words to describe these people. But there we are, 10 of the most impactful ways in which Brexit has screwed ordinary people. There are plenty of other problems Brexit has caused, but these, I think, are the easiest for most people to connect with. And another tragedy is that most of the public now see that Brexit was a mistake and should perhaps even be reversed. But they want the government to focus on the basics for now and maybe look at joining again later. If only most people realised that if we joined more quickly, the government would be able to fix those serious problems more easily, with less need to squeeze in other areas. 9 years of this country spiralling into decline, although the direction is more hopeful now. The UK-EU deal is a big step forwards in the right direction. The fact that both sides have committed to annual summits suggests that we're both committing to making improvements to our relationship every single year. Brexit was also supported by mostly elderly people and opposed by mostly younger people. Well, those younger people are going to be voting for a hell of a lot longer, so the direction of travel is towards the EU. And there are other factors as well. Both Russia and the USA are squeezing us, which means more people realise that we're better off allying with our real friends in Europe. Europe is under threat and we're stronger together. But let me know what you think in the comments below, and for more content you could subscribe to the channel or even join for access to streams and behind the scenes updates. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.